Yep. So we're going to work through the administrative detail here. This is a continuation of the immediately previous meeting, which occurred in the adjacent room. So our agenda still holds as planned. I would observe that the note well still applies to this meeting, just as it did to the previous half of the meeting. So keep that in mind. This is very much an IETF activity. Blue sheets are going around. It is not actually obligatory that you sign them both times since we're having the same meeting. But if you didn't sign them previously, by all means do so that we have an accounting of the fact that you were in the NETMOD working group. These are different blue sheets, yes. Okay, administrative details. We do have a Meet Echo session for this. I was scribing in there for who was speaking. We have the same Etherpad as previously. So we can just pretty much pick up where we left off. All right. So agenda-wise, we are going to start in with the design team. And so this is actually about half of our agenda for this session. And first up is Joe Clark. The versioning design team update.
All right, so there will actually be 3 of us presenting. Actually be 3 of us presenting today. I will be your first host.
I think you have to say next.
Oh, okay. Next, please. Using that. So our agenda today will be 5 minutes, hopefully less from me, followed by, I'm going to guess, the bulk of the time with Rob, and then Balash will round us out, and Rob will take us to next steps. Next, please. So the first thing we want to talk about is the versioning requirement changes. And the reason this is only 5 minutes is because this is going to be fairly short. Essentially, last time we agreed that we would adopt this document. It was still unclear as to what the fate of this document will be, if it will be taken to RFC or if it will just be something that the working group agrees to, that these are the requirements that we're trying to solve, and instead we will then adopt solutions, work through those solutions as a working group, and take those to RFC. But we did adopt it. There has been one change since just transitioning it over to an IETF NETMOD document, and that is change to text for requirement 1.4 based on feedback we got directly at the last meeting. Next, please. That change was the original 1.4 said essentially that non-backwards compatible changes must be allowed. There was some consternation over, well, why must they be allowed? Instead, what we really wanted to focus on was when non-backwards compatible changes occur, those changes need to be signaled or documented so that one can see that between 2 revisions of a particular Yang module, that non-backwards compatible changes have occurred. So what you can see down there under the new heading is the new text we arrived at. This was posted to the mailing list a little while ago. We haven't heard any additional comments on this. So at this point, the design team feels that the requirements draft, the IETF version at revision 01 is final. These are the requirements that we have been working towards in terms of a solution at this point. Questions? All right. As to what the final resting place of this document is, we of course leave that to the chairs in the working group. The design team feels that what I said earlier, this document will not progress to an RFC. It will just be there to serve as the guidelines for the requirements that will inform the solution or solutions that come forward.
My comment is actually on the next document, but it may be it's pertinent to this question. And it's really, why not combine the two? And you have like a solution overview document that repeats a whole bunch of requirements in it. If you really believe that we need requirements somewhere, let's keep it in one place rather than have, because the requirements, even though you don't think it needs to be documented, is documented twice. So it'd be great just to have one document, and maybe what we end up as from a working group is a requirements and solution overview or requirements and framework document, and that's how we end up publishing that. So we fold in what's now an individual document into the working group document and let that go forward. And maybe all the historic stuff goes in an appendix just for context, things like that.
Okay, so we do feel that documenting the requirements are important, not necessarily documenting them as a ratified document, but I get your point, and maybe that's what then will become of the framework of the next document that will be presented. Any other questions, comments? Uh-oh.
Benoit, don't worry, right? Lou, what you propose is fine, but can we agree that once the requirements are fixed in stone, even if they appear in document, we don't spend our time reviewing them all the time, because otherwise you're back to square one, right?
Well, we definitely shouldn't change this one once we're done with, the process of agreeing that we've arrived at that point.
Very good.
And actually, that's 100% my objection with repeating requirements in another document. Now I have to go review those, make sure they're right. Now we have to go discuss them. Is it the right way to summarize it? Let's not do that, please. So
we're in sync.
Yeah, our intent is that these requirements now become fixed. These are the requirements for which we're trying to solve. Rob.
Just a quick comment. Is this working? The requirements in the solution overview draft are only there to make it easier to read. So if it's easier to have them out, just refer to this one, that's also fine.
It's far easier to say the requirements are documented here, go read it. Rather than give a second set, which isn't written quite exactly the same way, that you have to figure out what's different, what's not different. I mean,
yeah, fine. Okay.
That's fair. Well, I'll be Rob. Why don't you get up here? I'm going to get out before something changes.
Okay, so I'm going to give a quick update on next slide, please. So I just want to, we continue to have semi-regular meetings since IETF 104. There's quite a few people who've dialed in either on a weekly or semi-weekly basis, and we've continued to progress various documents. I'd like to thank everyone down there on that list. I won't repeat them. And our main output really is that tweak the requirements document that Joe's just talked about, an updated sort of solutions overview draft that sort of tries to pin everything together and show you where the different bits of the solution hang together. And then our main focus has been working on this sort of new / updated Yang module revision handling draft that evolved from the semantic versioning draft that we presented in 104. And our opinion is that this draft accommodates all the sort of core feedback we received during the working group meetings and also the versioning discussions we had at 104. So we think it sort of reflects the consensus from that. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to spend the next 20 minutes discussing the solution overview and just trying to set the scene of where these drafts ought to hang together. Then there's going to be subsequent talks on some of those different parts. So next slide, please. So my intention here was that the solution overview draft is meant to be a sort of transient temporary document. The idea here really is just to help the readers who are reviewing those drafts understand how they fit together, what bits haven't yet been written but will be written. And my intention wasn't intended to take this to RFC. I mean, it could be done, but that the intention of this was to help people during the review process. In terms of update, there will be a separate presentation by Balaj on updated module revision handling. I will talk about Yang packages after this, and Rashad will talk about version selection. So those three ones will be covered in more detail. Next slide, please. So the overall solution, as we see it now, is made up of 5 different parts. The first one is an updated Yang module revision handling. So this is doesn't talk about semantic versioning at all, but talks about Yang module revisions and how they can allow non-backwards compatible changes and express those, and more branching and fixing other things related to that area. There's really just a semantic versioning number scheme that could be described fairly abstractly. That hasn't been written yet, but will be derived from the text from the previous one, draft VerDT NetMod Yang Semver00. So we'll take the semantic versioning definition from that draft and just extract that text and put it in isolation. So we'll do that in the next phase. There's a version Yang packages draft. Now this one was published, this update was published before IETF 104 and needs some changes to take into account the changes in the updated Yang module revision handling. So I will present that one this time. It wasn't presented in 104, but there needs to be some updates to that. There's also a draft for protocol operations for package version selection. So that's draft Wilton NetMod Yang verse selection 00. Again, that one was published before 104. Rashad will be talking about that. So again, that one is sort of quite an early draft. We expect there to be more substantial changes to that. And then the final part of this whole puzzle we think is tooling related to doing schema comparisons between either on a module by module basis, or you group a set of modules together into one of these Yang packages to actually version and be able to compare 2 schemas and report at the schema level what's different, or maybe on a per leaf node basis or data node basis what's changed between those 2 schemas. So that work is on is our lowest priority at the moment. We'll try and get the other work out of the way first. So next slide, please.
Before we go to the next slide.
Okay.
Can you talk about if there's any significance to the naming of the document? I notice we go through some transformations from version design team to our Wilton to Wilton.
Okay.
Is there any significance there we should read from that?
Well, I think probably not at this stage. The ones that came out of the VerDT, the design team, obviously have the VerDT prefix. The Yang version Yang packages and the package version selection were not work that was output from the design team. They were in the individual drafts that I wrote. But that's not because the design team doesn't align necessarily with that direction. I don't think. It was just more that's when they produced. The proposal later on here is for the design team to hopefully pick up those documents and work on them as design team documents. That's the plan, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. The name doesn't really, it's a file name, so it doesn't really matter. But whether we have a complete solution from the design team or a partial solution, I think does matter. And we really are looking, the chairs are really hoping to get a complete solution from the design team.
Yeah.
And if for some reason the design team didn't feel that that was an attainable goal, we should talk about that. So it's great to hear your plan.
Okay.
And so it's all good.
So, yeah, okay. So go back. One comment on that. Not everyone in the design team believes that the version selection is required, I would say. So that's the one.
We just heard that we're not going to re-adjudicate our requirements, and that it's in there as a requirement. So,
yeah, so I think that's fine.
So, it's okay. We're not going to debate that again.
Good. So of the first of those 5 drafts, the updated Yang module revision handling, this is the one, there's a more detailed talk on this by Laj, who will cover all of the different parts of this in a lot more detail. So this is just a 1-slide summary of what we've done and what the draft covers. You have the core enhancements to Yang are to allow, but not necessarily encourage, non-linear module development, e.g. for bug fixes. So we allow some sort of branching to occur in Yang module history, and to document when non-backwards compatible changes have occurred in the revision history. So we're not saying that, we're not encouraging that people should do this, but even when they do occur, at least be able to describe that so that when clients, so when people read these documents or client tools are processing them, they can know where non-backwards compatible changes have occurred. The next part of that is that we still identify module revisions uniquely using the revision date. So nothing's changed from what we have today, but we allow a new free-form text label to be associated with a revision. And this text label it can be used effectively to overlay like a semantic versioning scheme, for example, or some other scheme that somebody else comes up with. We're not defining within this document what the form of those text labels can be, but we do allow these revision labels to be used when in the file name, for example, in replace of a revision date, and the import by derived revision, again, can also use this label as well. We define a new version of import. So today Yang has an import that will choose any revision, or has an import that chooses a very specific revision. And one of those is too general and one of them is too specific. So we are introducing one that's import by revision data or derived. And that effectively will find you a revision that is either that or that's within its history. And so that's the intention there is if a module that you're importing has a new container added into it or a new node that you're referencing, then you can put dependency on that revision or later. So you put in that source code dependency. We define backwards compatible versus non-backwards compatible changes, and these are actually the non-backwards compatible change. So backwards compatible changes are very close to what is defined in RFC 7950 with some tweaks. And the non-backwards compatible one is fairly obvious from that. We clarify and improve Yang status handling. So in particular, we clarify that deprecated means you still have to implement the node, or otherwise use deviations to indicate you're not implementing it, and obsolete means you don't implement the node. And then finally, we've added some, updated some guidelines for how you update Yang modules based on these updated rules. Next slide, please. So the second draft, and this one's not been written yet, and this is a semantic version number scheme. So I'm just saying what the plan is for doing it, and we intend to do this over the next window, next 4 months, is to define a semantic versioning scheme that allows for bug fixes to released software assets. So effectively, it's what's already documented, the algorithm in the draft VerDT netmod yang semver 00. And it's a version of semver 200, but with the ability to add these bug fixes in to the released assets when necessary. The main changes to it is that it doesn't actually now need to define what constitutes a backwards compatible or a non-backwards compatible change. That would be assumed to be defined outside this. And this is what will be used, we expect, at least for some people, as a revision label. So effectively, the revision labels you have will use this semantic versioning scheme, so you end up with having semantic version for your Yang modules. And then again, it's worth pointing out that in terms of this versioning scheme, it's not going to be tied to Yang. So although it will be defined, it'll have some references to the Yang models, it could be used anywhere where you want to do this sort of semantic versioning of assets, but you want to have a bit more flexibility to put bug fixes in to older released code or released APIs. Next slide. So Yang packages, again, an overview. I've got a bit more detail on this later on. So what is a Yang package? It's identifying a set of Yang modules and their dependency. So it's a bit like taking what's in Yang library and putting it into a file, or is one example, but it's a bit more flexible than that. So whereas Yang library will tell you what the schema is for a particular data store on an entire device, this allows you to do subsets of Yang modules, so bits of stuff together and group them. And the key thing here is that those packages can then be versioned in the same way that modules are being versioned. So rather than having each vendor implementing, choosing exactly which version module they want for every single Yang module they're implementing, I think the use of packages could encourage people to have more commonality in what they implement. So if you took the IETF Yang models, for example, you could have a package that defines the base models and types and things. You could have a separate package for routing. You could have a separate package for VPN services, for example, and those would be versioned over time. And so rather than somebody saying, well, I want this version of this or this version of that, you could choose something off that history of those version packages. Yes, Dan.
On the packages, you're saying, because you mentioned an example, you can choose like VPN services and routing services. Or actually, the routing package and the VPN package.
Yep.
You could have dependencies between packages.
Yes. Yep, and it copes with that. It has dependencies between packages, and you may have dependencies between packages that conflict.
Yes.
And
so that would be then how do you?
So
because you say, oh,
yeah.
This is up in the packaging, but then I might have an inherited conflict that I might not be aware I'm putting those packages together.
The solution here requires that you resolve those conflicts. At the time that you combine those two packages together into a combined package, any conflicting module dependencies you have to resolve and explicitly say how they're resolved. So yes, in terms of packages, they could be available offline using the Yang instance data document. The plan is to augment Yang library so that rather than necessarily downloading the full module list off a device, if you knew and expected what package version it's going to implement, you can just check that it's implementing what you expect. So make it an easier check for conformance-wise. And as I said, there's a separate presentation on this following later, so that's what I'm going to cover now. Next slide. So the fourth one is protocol operations for package version selection. So one of the key aims of Yang packages is to allow devices to potentially implement different versions of modules as cohesive sets, and then to allow clients to select which ones to use. So this could be done where they're choosing between some different sets of vendor modules, or it might be they want to choose to use the IETF Yang models or a particular version of the OpenConfig Yang models as examples. And so the package is identifying those sets of modules, and then you're using RPCs to select which ones to use. And this could be the case that the server only allows you to support implementing one particular package version for the entire management interface, or it may be that some devices allow you to have support multiple different package versions and to select those depending on maybe the session that's being used. So again, there's another presentation covering this, but as I say here, it's a fairly early draft. There'll be more changes in here, but really it's just the ideas that are being presented. Next slide, please. And then the last one, so there's no draft written yet. It's slightly lower priority. I do think it's a key part of this set, and that's to define an algorithm to compare two schema trees that detects backwards compatible versus non-backwards compatible changes. So it looks through those two schemas and says, look, these are where the changes are. So Yang already does some of this. The result could then be given at the schema level, or it could be given on a per data node level. And it could be also take into account features or deviations or the subset of the schema actually being used by the operator. So if they're only using a third of a particular protocol module, they're not using all these options, then when you're comparing to see what's changed between two versions of that module, you may not care if stuff has changed in the stuff you're not using. So again, being able to compare the schemas and subset it into the stuff you care about, I think gives you almost like the perfect answer. There is some cases where this is difficult to do. You can't, well, at the moment it's very hard to have tooling that would check the description statements and find out whether there's some change in the semantic behavior of a data node until our machine learning gets a bit better. XPath expressions and regular expressions are another cases where it's very hard to see what's changed. It's very hard to tell if it's a backwards compatible change that's been made in those cases. So I think there's consideration there as to whether we could use some form of annotation potentially to mark those cases where it might look like it's a backwards compatible change, but it's not, or vice versa. It looks like a non-backwards compatible change, but actually it's backwards compatible. Any questions on this one? Okay. Can't remember what my next slide is. Yes. So so this is just a chart. I'm not sure how accurate this is. It's effectively trying to show the dependencies between the modules, between the drafts, with the darker blue arrows showing sort of proper dependencies, and then the lighter colored arrows sort of showing user level dependencies. So where you may choose to use semantic versioning scheme, for example, but there's not actually a dependency between the drafts. As you can see that the module revision handling sits at the top and probably has the key dependencies. Then everything that might want to use semantic versioning scheme obviously has dependency on that, but other schemes could be used. It's just one choice. The packages draft depends on the module versioning, and the package version selection obviously depends on that one. And then the schema comparison tooling depends on packages if that's what you're comparing, or modules if that's what you're comparing there. Next slide. And that's it for me. So any questions on that overview section at all in terms of the sort of overall picture of how the solution fits together?
Kent asks, do you have any examples?
Examples of?
Sorry. Examples of the, sorry, what was the first one? Versioning.
The module one?
Yeah, because you're talking about a SimVer version, right? And we're using revisions. So do you have an example of what the new revision format looks like?
Yes, in the next, so the module revision handling draft will be covered in detail next.
Okay.
So that covers all that in a lot more detail. And there's examples in there. I will talk about the packages version schema draft after that. Rashad will talk about the package version selection. The two that we're not covering in any more detail today is the semantic versioning scheme that's based on what was there before, but we haven't written it yet, and the schema comparison tooling that we haven't really looked at in great detail.
What would you, the design team, really want from the working group today?
I think what I would like to know is whether people in this room think that as a sort of solution space of solving the entire problem does this look like the right set of things that we are solving? And does it look like it covers all the pieces you would expect it to cover? Does it look like it's broadly the right approach? So obviously there'll be comments on individual drafts and things, but does this look like overall the right thing?
Yeah, Bogdanovic, haven't read or I looked at some of the drafts. That work is needed. Exactly all of that what you show there, I'm not 100% sure on that part. Maybe the scope is too much of what they're trying to put in, but what I see as a problem when doing Yang are the dependencies and figuring out what are my dependencies, what do I have to load in order to enable the service.
Mm-hmm.
And if we are planning to be able to create abstractions at different layers, that knowing the changes when they're happening and be able to take into account them, and maybe even pre-package those things up and say, "Oh, here's my whole package," and it's getting deployed. You can unit test it, etc. It is very helpful. Exactly how to do that, that's a question now because there are many open issues that we're just beginning to discover.
Okay. Any other comments? So I think, actually there's an update slide at the end, but I think the plan will be to try and continue down this track effectively, and try and get these bits adopted as we go along.
Yeah, and as you heard earlier, or as I made a comment earlier, we're looking for the design team to come up with a full set of documents that answers all the requirements and then bring them to the working group for adoption call. So it's important to make sure that the working group is aware of what's going on in the design team and is generally aligned with the answers. Once once they become working group documents, we're going to follow a normal working group process, which is everyone in the working group will have an opportunity to provide input and influence. So it's not that at adoption we're done. It's that we have a focused team that's trying to give us a starting point.
Doug Hubler of Precomp. So when the semantic version sounds great, I was always wondering why it didn't start out that way. So that sounds great. When you're talking about visualizing the difference between schemas, would it be the resolved schema once you've resolved all the groups? Because usually that's what consumers of APIs are mentally, visualizing, or is it visualizing the actual Yang and the groups differently than that?
I think both is the answer. So I think if you're comparing a module itself, then you might do it on the module text. But even then, actually, I think you have to resolve the submodules and allow groupings and things to move around. So I think it's sort of the resolved schema to some level, but that might not be fully resolved with all dependencies. It might be this module with its dependencies still hanging and open, or it might be the entire schema like a Yang package. You take the whole package, resolve everything internally, and if it's a complete package, you then look at the actual abstract syntax tree for the Yang that you effectively constructed and could be comparing those on a node-by-node basis. Okay, I think it's time for Balazs.
Okay. So this draft is let's say the main output at this point. We derived it from the complete solution. We tried to separate parts of it. And we believe that we had discussions on the last IETF on the meeting, but also outside afterwards with many people. We believe that all the main comments were included. One point is that this applies to Yang modules. So sub-modules, they are very closely connected to the modules themselves. So they should just follow the modules themselves. Next, please. This updates a number of current RFCs. One is the Yang 1.1, because the update rules are sometimes not specific enough, but sometimes they're too strict. It also updates Yang library because the versioning provides additional information that we want to include there. And also the authoring guidelines, for example, revision information should always be present, and life cycles of the different schema nodes should be also included. Next, please. So what do we have here? We have an extension that will go into the revision statement and indicates that this revision of the Yang module is non-backwards compatible NBC to the previous version. If it's not there, then it's assumed or it must be backwards compatible. We also explicitly state that we allow nonlinear Yang module development, so branching and updating previous revisions, which was not forbidden in 7950, but many people assume that there we will have linear development only. We introduced revision labels because many companies have nice versioning schemes like Samware or some other ones. And they would like that information that gives a short compatibility information, short history information in some form to be included. Revision or derived was also mentioned earlier. So that states that you can import something that is newer than whatever module date you chose, but it can't be just a date because of the nonlinear development anymore. We had to update what backward compatible and non-backward compatible changes mean, because we want to accept some NBC changes, and especially the status-related changes were not clear in 7915. We have some additionals for status handling and Yang library updates, as we mentioned. Next slides, please. So maybe the most important part is here the red thing we have, NBC changes, that indicates inside the revision information that this revision made an incompatible, a non-backward compatible change compared to the previous revision. And it's always in this full list of revision statements, the previous revision. That means that you should not remove revision statements. Maybe you can remove the description part or shorten the description part, but you should not remove the revision statement itself, because at that point you lose this information. Also, you should add the revision statement all the time. I think it's not mandatory in 7950 every time. When at the green point where we just added functionality, we don't have this revision extension. Next, please. This will allow non-linear development. So here the February 1st revision date was also developed because whatever customer didn't want to upgrade to the new version. And then we have 2 branches. And there's actually no limit of branching. So you can branch the branch and then again and again to an infinite tree, although that's not a very good practice. But if business needs force, you can do that. Because if you look at it, every Yang file in itself is linear, but the Yang module might have multiple files that go on different branches on this tree. We don't, this is a possibility that can be misused. We don't recommend arbitrary branching, especially not for SDOs. Yeah. And each Yang module, the text file itself, will represent one root from the leaf of this tree up to maybe the root, or at least to some level. Next, please. So we have revision labels because the NBC only tells you that, yes, we have a change, but to actually understand that, you have to parse the module already and look up all the revision statements, which is quite a bit of work. So as an alternative, you can have a revision label that contains similar information. This draft does not say what is in the revision label. These are examples. And we'll have multiple drafts, or at least one drafts about, let's say, somewhere can be in the revision label. The format is rather free. The only concern is that it should not be mistaken as a date. And it can be used later for other in the import statements as well. Yeah, next one, please. Okay, here is an example of how the revision labels for somewhere would be. If you see that the main number changes every time when we have this NBC changes extension there. So from when we just add something, then we only go from 3.0 to 3.1. Next, please. Okay, import by revision or derived. That's a very important part of this work. So we said the simple import without any revision date is too liberal. If you have the revision date there, is too strict. What the usual case is that I want something that includes the functionality I'm depending on already, and anything later on, I very much hope that it will not remove the functionality I depend on. It's not a strict promise that everything afterwards is good for me, but usually it is enough. Revision or derived can be based both on the revision label, and it can also be based on revision date. Yeah. Next one.
Chance as a contributor?
Yes.
So on that previous statement, or derived, would it stop at a module revision that has NBC changes?
No.
Should it?
No, because most of the time the NBC changes don't impact the import. There's a risk there. And then we had in earlier versions very complex sets where we said that from this version to that version, and it got more and more complex. And usually you want to leave it open-ended because you don't know what the changes the new revisions will bring. And many, many times, even if the changes are NBC, they won't impact your won't impact your importers. So this is not if you really want to be strict and really be sure, then you must check every date, but we don't want to be there.
So, do I take it that the design team discussed this previously?
Yes.
And,
yeah.
okay, so
Actually, in the previous versions of the same draft, we had more strict and more complicated solutions, and this was the most user-friendly and still helpful.
Rob Wilson's just going. So I'm just going to add some other comments on that. So even though you've got the revision or derived dependency, that's almost like a source time dependency. When you actually come to use these modules, you use something like Yang library, Yang package, that will constrain exactly which version you're going to use anyway. And in the case that somebody comes along and breaks your source dependency, they made some non-backwards compatible change, at that point you'd be expected probably to release a new version, a new revision of your module to do the import that then fixes to a later revision or derived or changes that to then fix the import dependency again. So we think that this is the right balance of being not too strict, because otherwise, if you limit it, I think it's more likely that actually, as Balazs said, you're not going to be impacted, but you still have to update your module anyway. So we think it's better to ask forgiveness than to be too strict beforehand.
okay, I think my only analogy here would be like software. When you're building and you have dependencies on libraries, and you'll say, I depend on library, 3.1.2. So if 3.x I'll support, but if it ever goes to 4.x, I don't want to support that. So sometimes there's the ability to put brackets or limits into how much future you want to support automatically. But I accept, it's been discussed by the design team. I just wanted to make sure that was something that you guys have covered. And also, could you put the previous slide as well? I think it was, yeah, so this, the two feature statements that you're creating here, is this what I understand to be possible extensions to Yang, core Yang language?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Next. Okay, so in order to define what is, when we put in those statements, we have to define what is backward compatible in NBC. 7950 gives us a very good basis for that, but not the full statement, because deprecating and obsoleting nodes can actually be NBC or BC, depending on how it's implemented. What we assume is that if you deprecate the node, it's still there. So that's a backwards compatible change. But if you obsolete a node, then it will be removed, so that we define as a non-backward compatible change. Also, reordering data definition statements, in most of the cases, that should not hurt anyone, so that we allow that. And anything else is non-backward compatible. But stating that obsoleting is NBC, that's a definite change from 7950. Next. Okay, we have the we have the status statement in Yang. We want to change what deprecate and obsolete means. This is not a mandatory statement, so it's not a must or a shall, but we say that deprecators should be still there, working, fully functional, while obsolete should be removed. If you don't remove obsolete, that can that can also result in surprising and errors. So even for obsolete, I think it's important to define this. But for backwards compatibility, we put into the Yang library 2 extra leaves that states that, do you follow what we recommend here or not? If you don't put these extra leaves, then you are backward compatible, meaning you can do anything you like and your clients will be surprised maybe. Also, when you deprecate or obsolete something, often you have a reason for that. Often you have a timeline when you will actually remove it. Maybe you have a replacement. So a status description statement was added for that. Next.
Sorry, count as a contributor?
Yeah.
On that previous slide. So I like the idea of having an ability to specify whether or not the server actually complies or not. That being the case, why aren't these musts? I mean, and
Backward compatibility, I think, mostly.
well, for the second bullet point, it's okay if a server has data, more data than it should. But for the first bullet point where it says
No.
it should be implemented, it's must. I mean, how else can we have interoperability if it's not sure? If the clients aren't sure that it's actually there? How can
Because you can check in the Yang library that are all the deprecated nodes really implemented and functional. If you, sorry?
Just finish your point.
Well, okay, so the third, by saying Yang library, you're talking about the third bullet point.
Yes, that indicates if you follow the first two or not.
Okay, maybe it's just the way you're saying it. But are you saying that with the third bullet point that it's possible for the server to say that the first bullet point is actually, those two bullet points are actually musts, not shoulds?
Yes, if you,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Mhm.
Rob Wilson, Cisco. The other comment I'd make is if we get this into yang.next, then I agree that we would try and get these to be musts. We try and define what the behavior has to be.
Since you're doing extensions, you can change the rules for implementations that implement that extension. So you can say, if you implement this extension, you must do these things.
Okay,
And it's probably worth reducing the number of options. So in the case where you have an extension, think about making things more musts than shoulds.
okay, that seems reasonable.
Martin Björklund had in the previous meetings a very strong opinion that we need to indicate in the Yang library whether these first two rules are followed or not. We should not make them must.
I think you need the Yang library for backwards compatibility with the existing clients, but for people who are adopting this, so we perform with this, then I think you probably could get away with musts. And that's what we want, isn't it, ultimately?
Yes.
Because the existing rules effectively are broken.
Yes.
Because if you have constraints between different nodes, like must statements, a client cannot know from Yang library whether or not it has to implement a node. Because it doesn't know the server implements it.
Yeah, but I fully agree with you, Rob, but we had some pushback. That's why we have this in Yang library to indicate whether these are followed or not. Yeah, next slide, please. So what we have in Yang library is two nodes, deprecated nodes implemented, obsolete node absent. These are the first two bullet points we have discussed lately. And if they are not there, then anything can happen with these. That's one of the problems that in Yang 1.1 that the definition is too open. The other problem was that currently Yang library doesn't specify which revision of a Yang module is imported if multiple revisions are present. And that might mean in some cases that mandatory data nodes are present when we thought it's not, or mandatory nodes are absent when we thought they would be there. So yeah, it's kind of a bug, let's say, or a missing piece in 7950. So it's not the rules, data model of Yang library is not modified, but the rules, what they mean, are modified to make it very specific which module is imported in this case. Next slide.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Can I go back to the previous slide? Rob Wilson. Yes, it's 8525. So I've got a question here for Lou. Martin had mentioned whether, or the chairs, Martin had questioned whether the second point here, because this is really a bug fix, is this something that a RATA would be able to cover or not? My impression is it's a change of behavior, and hence it couldn't be covered in an errata. But he was of the opinion that if we could get in an errata, that would be better. It's clarifying behavior that's ambiguous today.
I'm still trying to digest which
So
point is the errata?
Second.
You are
It's the
importing-
second
Second main point.
It's the second of the second?
No, it's the both 1 and 2 of the second. So
I think I would need to see the errata before making a call as to the level of change that's being done there.
Okay.
To judge whether it was something that's suitable for errata or abyss or an update.
Okay, I'll try to seek up you afterwards to see.
I think the specific proposed text we have to look at, not the problem, but the solution.
Okay.
Ultimately, if you believe it's a clarification, you should probably just submit it, and then we can debate it. Because
Exactly.
then it will be an errata. Then it will be a unverified errata, and we can add it to the list or discuss it.
Yeah, I actually completely agree. That's the right way to do it.
Okay.
Is, put forward that errata, let the debate begin.
next slide, please.
Just as a heads
Yep.
up, we do actually have other things on the agenda.
Sorry.
And no, it's not you. Our first one ran really long. So you're right on track, but you're on track for like another 10 minutes
Okay.
for the design.
Yang instance data, it was required, the requirement to say what happens with versioning. Instance data itself is not versioned because what backwards compatibility means there, that's not defined. On the other hand, versioning is very useful for instance data understanding if the schema defining modules can be somewhat different. Next, please. And then we have some guidelines telling our authors how to do changes, that not to do NBC changes, and try to make the changes for the clients less painful, use deprecation, use this more flexible import, use status information and such things, and sometimes duplicate data to be able to use both new and old versions, or potentially version selection can also help. Next, please. If clients, this is kind of a requirement or recommendation for clients that yes, changes are coming and they should tolerate a number of changes, and also they should monitor what happens with modules. So they should check if the module is backwards compatible, non-backwards compatible, and prepare to migrate away from deprecated stuff in time. Next. And Rob, I think your turn. Any questions? Yeah, maybe that gentleman.
Rob, can you correct me?
Quickly, JP Lantry from Bell Canada. I was wondering what is happening when we're branching to the version numbers. You mentioned if you import a Yang module, then most likely if you're not specifying the version, and the most recent version will be the one applying. So when you have multiple branches,
my first answer is I don't know, I don't care. This only says that we have a revision label where you can put in some numbers. Now, there will be a separate draft about Samware-based revision labels. Yes, Samware has difficulty with unlimited branching. Whatever you put into the revision label will have its limitations. Or maybe you have a version numbering scheme that's all powerful, then no limitations. But that's not part of this draft.
Charles Eckel. One thing that wasn't clear to me from a quick read of this draft was, are you applying semantics or meaning to the revision
Label?
The number part? Yeah, you can call it revision label.
Again, we here in this draft, we just defined that there is a place where you can put that. In the further drafts, we'll propose a Samware-based revisioning system, and there they will have meaning, but not in this draft. We have a placeholder.
So Rob, I'll just add one comment to that. So a vendor might choose to choose their module labels as foo and bar and whatever. They could choose whatever they want. So it's whoever's doing that scheme is defining the semantics of the scheme. So very quickly to cover the next steps, there's just one slide here. And actually, we sort of discussed it earlier So at the beginning, we were going to seek adoption for this first draft. I think the feedback from the chairs was that actually they want to adopt this as a set. So, so I think effectively we're going to continue on the same track. Any comments we received on the module version draft we'll update, but the other ones we will effectively work on. The other ones, the semantic versioning scheme, Yang packages and version selection drafts, and also the tooling one, but I'm not sure we'll get those all done before the next IETF. There's still a lot of work there. And then on to Yang packages, please. That's it. So yeah, I've already covered a little bit of this. This is just a little bit more details. So next slide, please. This is on the Yang packages. Oh, okay. And so, yes, effectively the idea here, as before, as I said, is to version sets of Yang modules together with their dependencies. And in terms of how the Yang packages draft is written at the moment, it's using the Yang Semver solution as a way of identifying or the versioning number scheme for these modules. That's the one thing that I think we need to update or at least discuss relative to how we've changed the module level versioning and made the semantic versioning number a label, an option thing rather than something that's tied in. The packages can be hierarchical, so a package can import other packages and that can recurse down. The packages themselves can be either complete or incomplete, so you don't necessarily have to tie off all your dependencies depending on what you're doing, and that might help if you had dependencies on like type modules and things like that. You may not want to depend those. The packages themselves can be available from Yang library, or they can be available offline in Yang instance data. And in that Yang instance data discussion, there was talk about how you identify the schema using Yang library. I think Yang packages might be another example, which would be a good way of defining that schema, a better way, because it's more what you're actually trying to do rather than Yang library that's returning slightly different information. And as I mentioned, the draft is slightly out of date because it hasn't been updated with the changes that we've done to the module level versioning. You say it works, but I don't think it does. So, oh, yes, it does. It's just slow. Oh, right. Shout. Okay. So why do Yang packages? So we're trying to solve several problems here. We want to actually get consistent version sets of modules. Just versioning modules individually, when you have hundreds of them or tens at different organizations, becomes too hard. It's too complex. And it's too likely that different vendors will implement different versions of the same modules and get too many incompatibilities. So for one vendor, they might implement BGP version 2 and OSPF v1, and on a different OS or a different vendor does BGP v1 and OSPF v2 Yang models. And then when it comes to an operator and they're trying to use these, well, neither of those sets are ideal because they can't get a consistent set across both of them. If you've got Yang packages and you're versioning for like the IETF routing protocols, and every time the module gets a new routing module gets updated, you add that into the Yang package, then and you version that Yang package, you've now got a more linear update in terms of how these packages are evolving. But you're not fixed to that. You can still deviate those the packages that you're still using. You can override and say, actually, I'm going to support this baseline package with these changes and these differences to it. Another use case for them is to avoid downloading this full set of modules off the device and having to check exactly what you want, because that's a hard thing to do. It'd be much nicer to say, actually, I support this package or these packages, these APIs are things I support with these modifications. And rather having to do an individual check on every single module, you've got a higher level conversation about the API that you're supporting. And as I say, and again, you can do this with Yang library, making the schema available offline so you can check it in advance, and you can design your tooling to expect to talk to a device and expect which API, which package version it's using, and correlate those is easier than having to deal with full sets of packages when they full sets of modules when they differ. Next, please. So this is just an example that I've got a simple IETF network device, version 1.1.2. There's some metadata, description, and other information where you can a URL of where to download that package from. And that lists a set of modules that it implements here, and it lists a set of modules that are import only. And again, this could be fully resolved, it might not be resolved. And the definition includes metadata like URLs, where to find it. It lists features that are mandatory. So which features that if you implement this package, you are obliged to implement and support. It has a list of the imported packages, there's none shown here, but a list of the packages you're importing, lists the modules that are implemented by that package and the import-only modules. So it's very similar to Yang library from that point of view, except it recurses and has a list of imported packages. And then finally, and again, it's not shown here, is import conflict resolution. So if you combine two packages and they each of those packages import different versions of modules and you have conflicts. So when you do that, when your package pulls in two separate packages with conflicts, you specify exactly which version of which module you resolve to. Next slide, please. There's only one more slide. So this is another example package, example IETF basic routing package, and this one is importing from network devices 1.1.2. And then so it lists the extra modules that are implemented as part of that, extra imports on top of that. And as I said before, any version conflict or change must be explicitly resolved. That's one thing that's critical here, that for a given package definition, the list of modules that it's using is exactly tightly defined. That's the specific versions. And the package version indicates the nature of change in the modules or package imports. So the version number that we're using here is again using like a semantic versioning scheme. So if you update your package to include a module that's changed in a non-backwards compatible way, which in Semver would mean going from 2.00 to 3.0.0, then your package would also have a major version change in its version number as well. If you had minor version changes in your packages, or you're importing more modules in your package definition, then you have a minor version change. So it's using the same Semver ideas and rules and things for doing versioning, but applied at a package level rather than a module level.
Kansas, the contributor?
Yeah.
On the 2 slides back, you said that if you say that you support the package, you're obliged to implement all the package versions as they are. I just wanted clarification on that. Does that include features and or deviations?
So what you would be allowed to do is you'd be allowed to, rather than saying you implement this package, you would implement your own package on top of that that includes this one, and then has extra modules with deviations listed. In terms of features, you would list the features you support, but you're obliged to support the features that are listed here, the mandatory features, or otherwise deviate those nodes. So you can still use deviations and changes, but you have to make them explicit. And then the key issues, the key question in terms of updating this draft. So the current package draft uses Yang Semver as the versioning scheme, because that was based on the work that we did for IETF104, where it looked like that was the versioning scheme we were going to use. But the latest module level versioning now has been decoupled. So in terms of the module revision handling and its concept of backwards compatible versus non-backwards compatible changes, is separated from the versioning scheme that you're using. So Yang Semver is one of the examples of the versioning scheme you could use. So I think probably it's better for Yang packages also to have that same decoupling. So for it not to be hard coded to a particular semantic versioning scheme, but just to say, actually, it can use any scheme that's partially ordered set of identifiers and have that more flexibility in terms of what it's done, or in terms of what it uses, and allow Yang Semver as one example of what could be used in that case. Then the question is how flexible are you in that? How do you do that? Do you have an identifier or an enumeration to identify the different schemes? I'm not sure we want to have a huge proliferation of them, because every single different scheme will have impact on clients that need to be able to compare these things. So, but at the same time, tying it to Yang Semver might be a mistake. Does anyone have any thoughts or opinions on this?
Charles, that's unfortunately more of a version of the package, as you said it would be ordered. So is it implied that as the version of the package increases, the version of the things inside of it would increase also, or stay the same, or could they actually go backwards if they want?
I think they're entirely decoupled. So I think you would be allowed to. So there's no correspondence between the package version number and the version numbers inside, other than the semantic change to the package. So if you've made a change to what's included in that package that's non-backwards compatible because you've changed to a non-backwards compatible module, or you've down-revved the module, that would be like a non-backwards compatible change to that package definition. So it would go from 100 to 200 if you were doing a down rev, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yes, you could actually. I mean, I was thinking of a case where like you start supporting a newer version of some Yang module, then you realize, oh, that one gives us all kinds of grief, and so you want to go backwards. Yet your package number would, increment.
Yes. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this issue at all? Opinions?
Are you coming up because you're speaking next, or are you?
Am I speaking next? Oh, no, I'm coming up.
Okay.
Rashad from Cisco. So I read the draft again last week, I forgot. Conflict resolution. You mentioned, I think, in one slide between two different packages and a different slide inside one package. How do you explicitly solve the conflict? Is it by saying I want version X?
Yes. So you effectively say on the conflict resolution, you say I want to have this particular version. And I think I'm trying to remember. I haven't read the draft recently, but I think in terms of import only, again, you might need to identify which specific import you are overriding and the overriding version. But at the end of the day, you're explicitly saying this is the version I'm going to use in this circumstance. And I think you are now up.
So can you elaborate either on your view or the design team view of why you want to allow multiple ways of identifying versions? What's the benefit for that flexibility?
So in terms of the module level version, the reason for doing that is because that's what some people wanted. They thought that they don't like the Yang Semver scheme because they find it too restrictive, some people. Other people think it's not, or as in, why don't we just use the standard Semver? And I think it's not flexible enough. So there's different opinions as to what versioning scheme is required. And if you are a vendor and you end up having arbitrary branching of your modules for whatever reason, then the Semver scheme we're defining can't accommodate that, deliberately so. It's limited, deliberately some partial branching, but not too much. So I think that's the reason we had that separation in the module level stuff. And then in terms of packages, the question is whether if you've got modules that have that flexibility and you package them together, you probably need a versioning scheme for the package that has the same level of flexibility.
Yeah, I would expect as we progress from the design team to the working group to eventual something we submit to the ISG, we'll really want to think hard about whether we want that flexibility. Because anytime you have flexibility, what that really leads is to interoperability problems. And of course, the reason we have standards is, for interoperability. So if there's good reason to allow those different options, sure. But if there's not, we should think really hard about the cost of that flexibility.
Yep, agreed.
Continue question about I'm Jifeng Liu from Water Networks. Continue question on that conflict resolution. Can we go back to the slide? So any version conflict must be resolved. How do we resolve that?
So if, for example, this was importing two modules, two different packages, and one of them was using IETF types version 100, and the other one's using IETF types 101, right. Then this package, as well as doing the import, would say, I'm going to use IETF 101 as my version for this package.
Right. But what if I need that older version for this package? And another package, I need a newer version.
Then, but each time you're combining modules from two different packages, or two or more packages, you're explicitly resolving that. You're specifying exactly which module you're using. And if they,
dependency, right? So one module need to use the interface 1.0. Another module, another package need to use a interface 2.0. They are not compatible, and I have to use two packages together. How do I do that?
well, that I think is something you can't do. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're trying to combine different,
No, if you see the current C library, one set of application uses libc 6.0, another set of C application uses C library libc 7.0. So we're okay. We have both libraries there.
so you define two packages in that case. You do.
Yeah, we have two packages here, but they use two separate interface modules. One is the 1.0, another one is 2.0. Are they okay?
But if you've got that sort of split in your Yang ecosystem,
Right.
where you've got the modules that are that different, and there's no way you can combine them, you've got some dependencies on the old and the new. Well, you're combining them into one package. So if you've got dependency says half of my package depending on IETF interfaces 1 and half is depending on IETF interfaces 2, and there's significant changes between the two, then you've either got to split that and just do them for one and a separate set of packages for the ones that are depending on version 2. You can't magically put those things together. This won't fix.
What if I don't want to combine them, but I want them both working on the same system together?
Then Yang does not allow that. Yang says you can only implement a single version of a module. You can import multiple versions, but in terms of implementation, you can only, for given schema, you can only implement one version of a Yang module.
Kent as a contributor. So actually, it's possible if you have two different NetConf or RESTConf servers. Each server has to have a specific implementation.
Sure.
But a device could have more than one server.
But in that case, you're into separate packages.
Sure, exactly. Okay, to your point.
Right. So my feeling is that combining merging packages sometimes may not be practical. There's too much implication on that.
But the same issue exists with using Yang libraries. It's no different in that scenario. So if you're you can't do it in Yang packages, it means you can't do it in Yang library either. There's no fundamental difference there. It's just how they're being pieced together.
You have a bigger workaround that will always solve the issue, that you go back and change the import statement to a specific revision date in one of the conflicting modules, and then it's gone. Sorry?
Can you use the mic, please?
We still need to have two interface modules.
Yang doesn't allow it. Only one version or revision can be implemented. Full stop.
You have to say next.
Okay. Yes, so I'll be presenting the version selection draft on behalf of Rob and myself. So this slide talks about why are we doing this? Well, this comes from the requirements 3.1 and 3.2 from the requirements draft Joe spoke about. And what this is basically saying is because Yang modules are changed in non-backwards compatible ways, we need to help clients migrate, so servers can support multiple versions and help clients select which version they actually want to run with. Next, please. So the summary. So it allows servers to do non-backwards compatible changes without forcing clients to immediately migrate. It does make use of the Yang packages draft Rob was presenting earlier. And it provides mechanism for servers to advertise what versions of the packages they support, and it allows clients to choose among the ones advertised which one they want to run with on a particular session. Next, please. So before people start throwing bricks, servers are not required to concurrently support clients using different schema versions. Those things are optional. Servers are not required to support every published version, and they are not required to support all parts of all version schema. The important thing is when we say support non-backwards compatible changes, if you remove functionality in the later Yang version, obviously you cannot support the newer one and the older one. But in some cases, if you've reorganized your Yang module, you've moved your nodes around in a non-backwards compatible way, the server should be able to support all, the older version and the newer version. Next, please. Okay, so the overview, which you'll see in the Yang tree next, is a version schema. It's a Yang schema, which Rob was talking about, with an associated Yang revision. That could be the semantic version number in the draft, which will be done soon. And yes, as I said, this could be Yang package. The schema set is a set of related Yang schema, one per data store. The servers support configuration for the default schema, and they also support configuration for what we call the secondary and maybe more netconf, restconf instances to use different schema. This is done via port number for both netconf and restconf. And for restconf, we also support the different root path, root resource to select which schema to use. This is it for this slide. Next, please. And this is basically the schema tree for what I was just describing. You can see, you can configure the schema sets and all that are read-write, but in terms of the information per data store, that's all what the system, the server, decides to support. I don't believe we got any comments on the. We probably need to do an XREV based on the latest discussions from 104 and all that. And hopefully we'll get comments on this draft and the Yang packages draft. And as Rob was explaining earlier, in the next steps for the design team, we actually want this draft, which is currently a private draft, to be part of the design team work. Questions?
Don't feel obligated to rename it. If you want to rename it, that's fine, but don't. It's okay not to.
Okay.
Kent, as a contributor, seeing the protocol names there alerts me just a little bit. Netconf, RESTconf. What about other like CoAP? Do we have to call out those protocols by name here?
Well, if we just support port, we don't have to. I believe my recollection is they're separated because RESTconf has the root path support. But I mean, the root path support has not been discussed. Maybe we'll take that out. So.
Yeah, since they're optional, you can still have both of them and then only set them when applicable.
Yep.
So Bob Wilson, so going back to Kent, do you have a suggestion here of how you think this should be done? Because I know with the key store drafts and things, you've got more separation. So is that what you're suggesting might be a good approach to use?
I was leading up to it. I was looking at the port and I was wondering what the intention for that port was and why wouldn't we be using the appropriate client server drafts from NetConf?
Oh, okay. Well, it's referencing those directly.
Okay.
That works. Yeah, I'm more happy to reuse that. So
okay. Well, I mean, so this isn't even adopted work yet, but I assume that work in NetConf will be done before this, and so hopefully it'll just make sense to reference it then.
And actually, related to that, I think eventually this draft would probably end up in NetConf rather than NetMod.
Good. Done?
Yeah, I think we're done. Yeah, Michael Wang is up with a Yang model for event management.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Michael from Huawei, and today I want to introduce the update of Yang data model for event management. Okay, this draft defines a Yang data model for the ECA-based network policy management, and it can provide some ability to for the network management function to control the configuration and monitor state changes on the network element. And if the trigger condition be matted, and it can perform some simple and instant action. And this document has been discussed twice in the working group, and it seems many people are interested in related works. So we update the document, and in this version, we add a new leaf, a group ID. It can be used to group a set of events that can be group a set of events that can be executed together to perform some specific task. For example, to provide the service assurance, and we also optimize next event leaf, moving it from the action list to the trigger condition list, and allow the one event trigger to reference another event's definition. And we change the threshold condition into the variation condition to further clarification the difference between the Boolean trigger and the variation trigger. And we also simplify the action container. In this slide, we provide an example how to use this module to perform some tasks. And here we define event A, and it be used to monitor if the trigger A to B be set up, so it can trigger event B. And the event B use a call event if the event A exists and the Boolean condition met, then it triggers corresponding action to active standby failover. Okay, and we use a group ID to group these two events to perform the provide the service assurance test. Okay. Okay, this document have discussed at least at this time is already discussed 3 times, and is seems many people are interested in these works. So I think maybe we can think about adopt as a working group document. Okay. Any question?
Yes. Yeah, is there somebody, comment at the mic?
Tim Carinoki, I do have a question, if I could. I'm trying to understand, what is the relationship of this document with the routing policy work that they've already adopted?
Routing policy, I think, is just is provide for routing policy, and here we use this use this module to perform such as service assurance. If here is example, if for example, if the lost packet cross the threshold, then it can perform the related action. For example, log in the lost packet cross threshold, and then perform some action to active standby failover. That's what I says.
My question is, and I just want to understand. So the routing policy document, I understand it's for the domain.
Yeah.
For policies and routing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But it uses ECA, right? And it looks like this is more of a generalization of that. Is that an accurate reflection or an accurate depiction?
We want to define the more generic module, and it can perform provide ability to do the service assurance, or do or monitor the here. Okay.
So there are within the routing policy draft, they make assumptions in that draft of certain scoping, like all, doing some stuff with all and some other stuff. Is that how much? I'm concerned about overlap between what's defined in the working group draft by the routing group and what's here, to make sure if this is really a generalization of that specialization, that it all kind of fits in a dovetail, right?
No, I understand your question, but here our document, this module does not want to cover the routing policies works, and here is just to provide, okay, if the some condition met, and we can do some management works like yeah.
AC Lindum, Cisco Systems, and offer the routing and policy document. One of the co-authors. I'd just like to state that this is more a data plane document, whereas the routing is strictly a control plane. The policies for a control plane for the selection and fleet and redistribution, import, export between protocols. So there isn't, other than the word policy, it really don't dovetail. Yes.
So if I understand this correctly, thank you, Clerk. If I understand this correctly, there's no correlation between the work that's being done in the routing working group and the policy. They're using event condition action as well. That's why I was asking the question. And this work here. Is that accurate? Now, this work here, I wanted to make sure I understand this correctly. Is this work just data plane, or is it meant to be general? Is it meant for control plane or other types of usages?
Okay.
This is I think the intention for this model actually is provide a closed loop service management. It's the closed loop life cycle of service management. So they can glue the telemetry model and provision model. So this using this kind of policy model, so they can trigger the automation, network management automation, or service management automation.
But is it then destined for applications in the control plane, data plane, or both?
I think not sure we should extrude the control plane, but I think maybe target to the data plane and the managing plane.
Okay. So I'm just going off of what was said. Okay, I got clarification now.
Okay, thank you. Who's read Benoit Clay's?
So Benoit Clay's, just to explain Tim some background information. So we created a working group called SUPA in the past, Simplify Use of Policy
Structure, framework.
So that working group was closed because it wasn't progressing fast enough. Now the working document that was there became an individual draft that was submitted there as the main reference, which is policy one. Yeah. And in that SUPA working group, the goal was to do something generic, so that the policy, the routing policies could be reusing that, and security policies could be reusing that. Yep. So now it's in the mix, right? It's based on a policy document which is in the draft, but trying to do something generic while the world has been moving on. So this is like discrepancy.
Well, yeah, and everyone still needs one of these too,
yes,
for each of their applications. So who's read this? It's actually been here twice, I believe, so far. The 00 and the 01 have been presented here. So who has read it either in its present O2 form or in one of the previous forms? Okay, so some people have read it. Of those people who have read it, well, actually, let's just generalize that. Let's say yeah, who here is interested in the topic and thinks we should do work on it? Okay, no hands went down there, so.
That's a reasonable number.
That's a reasonable number. Like that is at least as much attention as many of our drafts get. Who thinks we should be doing this somewhere else or not at all? Okay, nobody. So it sounds like you're probably here for better or worse. Yeah, so we're at a starting point. I don't think we will. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Do we want to poll for working group adoption after this?
I think it would be interesting to see how many think this is a starting point. We asked that the last meeting, and there was a pretty small number. It would be interesting to see if that changed.
Are there people who are not on the list of authors presently who are interested in this work with an eye towards participating in it? Any hands for that? Okay, well, one partial hand from somebody I greatly respect. So I guess that's probably of some value. Yeah, I think we'll probably poll for adoption on the list after the meeting. That's what it sounds like.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next presentation. Chin presenting. Yeah,
Hi.
NMDA-based notification, and Chin Wu is presenting.
Yeah. My colleague is not here. I will present this topic. My name is Qin Wu. Actually, the topic is about NMD-based notification for intent-based configuration update. Actually, this draft has been around for a while. Actually, moved from NetConf. Actually, has already presented twice in NetMod. Actually, my colleague actually revised this draft based his experience on the network configuration verification. So we think we most link this draft to the NMD diff actually but they can work together with NMD diff. The problem is NMD diff right now can compare the difference between the data store, but the limitation is they lack capability to verify whether network configuration from intent or other source take effect. So we think so that the solution we propose is to define notification actually to report this kind of network verification event to track these misconfiguration issues. But we cannot track all of these misconfiguration issues because for some cases it may rely on you need to export data from different devices. So we give some cases like you want to maintain the consistency in network configuration may cover 2 different devices. You want to maintain the consistency, but this is something we cannot address use this event. And here we give 1 use cases, and we think we can use NMD to compare the intent with the operational data store. And we have 2 different cases. So for some object that may be present in intent but not present in operational, for example, you may have an interface but not physically exist. So they can exist in the intent but not exist in the operational. Another case is they may present in operational but not present in the intent. So typical case actually is interface MTU. And so here the mechanism we propose actually we need to make sure the server can detect the hardware change. So this may rely on the system interaction with the hardware. So based on this assumption, actually, we can detect whether there's some misconfiguration issues. And probably, actually, here we give an example is we can compare the difference between intent and operational, and we can make sure all this actually caused by some misresource. And here is the model structure. We make some change actually. We introduce application tag actually to provide additional to provide a new parameter to identify each update. And Also, we clarify the difference with NMD-diff, and we think this can work together with NMD-diff, and this is the position of this NMD notification, and we already present this in the last IETF meeting, and we show how the position of this message. So this draft has been around for a while, and we think actually they seems can synergize with NMD-diff, so we want to hear what a working group think about this again.
Yeah, so I think the challenge with discussing this, since I don't see anyone running to the mic at the moment, is that at 104 and 103, there were pretty few people who had read this. I guess that, can we have a show of hands of anybody who's read this in either its present form or the, I guess, 01 and 02 versions that are have been previously presented? Okay, well, there's a few. Do any of those people have a willingness to express an opinion as to whether or not this work is worth progressing? Rob, I'm going to put you on the spot.
So Rob with Cisco. So I'm not sure. In terms of how I imagine these systems working, I would imagine more that the devices will just monitor operational and monitor the system that way round. So rather than getting errors back from the apply failures, whether you just monitor operational and detect the changes between what you as an operator wanting the device to do and what it's actually doing. So that's one observation. The other one is, I think that it's possibly really hard for some systems to implement this, to be able to report back when some of these operations have failed, because it's been committed to the running data store, the configuration's there, the actual apply phase within the system might go through many different daemons and might have other intermediate failures and things like that. So I think generally, in my experience, it's really hard to track these errors back. We've always struggled with this sort of thing. So I'm not sure if that helps. I don't know. So I'm not sure we would implement this.
Yeah, one clarification, we think actually network configuration verification is very popular. There's a lot of, research on this, and, this seems actually more linked to the system state that put into the operational data store. Actually, we can leverage this network verification mechanism to do that is possible. So that's why I bring up this kind of idea again.
So, so certainly for the verification side and checking that the configuration is valid at the point you write the data store, that I completely agree with, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
But in terms of the next step of applying it, which is sort of asynchronous or semi-asynchronous in the systems I'm aware of, that's the bit I think that's hard to then track back. So I think that if you have a simple device, you may be able to do that, and this may have value for that. But I think there's many devices that this would be really too tricky to do, and instead you expect the operator to be monitoring the operational state of the device and the applied configuration to infer whether this has happened or not. Another observation here is that some things, this configuration takes a long time to be applied. So what do you do in that sort of scenario?
Yeah, Tim Carey, Nokia. So when I read the draft, okay, there was a couple things that was running through my mind that I just couldn't form an opinion on, because what I've seen here is what we've done in the past is we've created the examples that you use that says, look, I have something that I have assigned or provisioned it, and now I'm going to equip it, and there's a difference between that. We call them differences between data stores now, but it's an equip each assignment problem, right? And in the past, we said, okay, those are just status. I'm assigned, but I'm not equipped. I'm equipped. My old TL1 is, right? Yeah. Okay. So that's been usually solved in a status type of thing, right? All right. So, so I was struggling when we wanted to produce notifications for that, right? Typically, you produce notifications when there's some sort of mismatch of equipment. I'm assigned to be this, but someone plugged in that, right? And that, I didn't get any of that from this particular draft, those things, where I think it's also solved that those particular notifications aren't generalized notifications. There's notifications in the context of the problem that you're trying to resolve. I'm trying to do equipment, I'm trying to do that type of stuff. And so that's where I was like going, I don't know if this will, if you, realistically, if this will be of any real use, because I think it's the problem domain that's of the use. And the person or the entity that's interpreting that is not the server, the thing being actuated, but the thing that's doing the actuation of the client. And that's what I was going through my head as I went through this. I go, I don't know. There's other ways of doing it, and I don't know if it's the right perspective.
Thank you. I think what we're hearing here, is some people who've given this a little thought, but they're not necessarily interested in being consumers of it. And that would actually, I think, be the sort of thing that would drive interest towards implementation and refinement, and would also get us better feedback. So I think I think barring some kind of expression of interest of that variety on the list, this is probably not something that we need to revisit. If we can find that or muster the energy in the community for people who are interested in it, then I think it's pretty easy to come back here and go, well, we've reviewed this enough that we can call for adoption. Okay. But I don't think we have the level of energy or enthusiasm with respect to being consumers of this that would cause us to really ask that question at this point.
Okay.
Thank you for your diligent effort, however.
Yeah, thank you.
To refine this into something and to seek feedback.
Thank you.
Don't go anywhere.
Yeah, yeah, another one.
So this is the last agenda item. This guy or there's any other? No, that was in the other. The other room. It's in the other room.
So scroll up. Scroll down. No, it's all that one.
Not this one actually.
No, that's wrong.
Yeah.
No, we deleted that.
I think not this one. Right?
Not this one.
We focus on MD transition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go back. And you scroll down. Reload? This was a caching problem or something.
MD protocol transition.
Do you see it?
Yeah, I see that.
Where?
The last.
Oh, it's in the middle. It's
Yeah, in the middle.
Fourth
Yeah.
line.
Yeah.
Down.
Downtown.
Down.
There we go.
I'm gonna go on the line and fix that again. So weird.
Okay, this is Qingwu again, and I want to talk about the NMD protocol transition issue discussion. There's many discussion here. We already have a lot of discussion on these kind of issues. Actually, recap a little bit because right now, actually, Netcom RESCOM NMD has already been published, and actually right now most IETF young data model should be the NMDA compliant, and also there's more young data model that developed should be the NMD compliant, but we still see actually there's some temporary no MDA actually exists to bridge the gap over the time period until the NMDA can be available. So we see there's a transition stages. So our confusion is how long this transition period will take actually when this can get started so we have some misconception. We think the current NMDA young guideline actually only provide the guideline for the young transition, but it doesn't provide the transition guideline for the protocols actually. So especially another case actually, so protocol actually, if protocol support NMDA, but you still can use some non-NMDA modules. So this is something we think maybe there's some gap actually. Maybe this is a misconception. We already discussed this on the mailing list, also offline discussion with several people. And so here we give several options. We have a client actually. They can be the NMD client, can be a non-NMD client. For the device who support the NMDA, could be the NMD server and non-NMDA server. But in between, we think maybe there's a cases. For the server, they only implement the NMDA mechanism, but it doesn't implement doesn't support NMDA combined young data model. So actually talk with some people. We think they think the semi NMDA is very confusing. Maybe we just we can remove this semi NMDA. So based on this assumption, actually, we think, the current problem is when the non-NMDA client, they talk to the server who support NMDA and non-NMDA, actually using the traditional get operation, you cannot get the system generated configuration. So we try to address these issues. We propose 3 different solutions. So the first one actually, we can add the state copy node in the NMDA young data model. But I think this is not a good approach because we already moved toward the NMDA. If we add back, actually, it seems actually not reasonable actually. But this is one solution we can using the get operation, traditional get operation to get the system generate data. The second option is we can, define the state module. State module will using the same structure as an NMDA module, and this is something already be discussed in the NMDA young guideline. And but the problem is this state module. Actually, for some cases, you may, when we actually move toward the NMD, for some of the NMD model doesn't define this state module. So that will cause, when we implement this, we need to implement some non-standard state module. So whether we should, ask all the NMD module to provide the state module. So this is something we think could be the solution. But with this state module, we can actually address the problem. We can get a system generated configuration from these state modules. The third option, actually, we can actually enhance the get operation to allow use this traditional get operation to get a system generated data. But this actually the impact is unimaginable. So we think that that's possible to address the gap, but we think it's very the influence we haven't evaluated. We think maybe it's very hard to proceed this. So we propose these 3 different solutions. So the first the question we want to ask is actually just as we assume, actually we may have for the server, they may support semi-NMDA. So we, so the question is, should we support, when we migrate to the NMDA, should we just first we support NMDA protocol like a netcom, rescom, NMDA support, and then we can support NMDA young data model, or when we implement, or the other choice is we implement the young data model and NMDA protocol at the same time. So, we for the option we propose, actually we may have 3 options. We may actually, we think we can skip this transition stage. We can go directly to the NMDA solution. Actually, this already be done by IETF. It's a complete standard solution. But the problem we are facing is we assume many network client doesn't support NMDA for right now at this stage how to migrate it. And so we propose another 2 options. One is option 1. Actually, option 1, actually, you may take one of the solution. We prefer actually the solution 2. Actually, you may define the state module, but this is not a standard state module in some cases. So another one, we just agree there's a transition stage, but we may have different no standard solution. We can pick what we can take. So that's the option we think we can address these kind of issues. Any comments on this?
So Rob Wilson, Cisco. I mean, I think pragmatically, probably it's option 2. So I think one comment here is that potentially for a given server or vendor, they could have a bespoke vendor config switch to choose whether it's running in an NMDA mode or non-NMDA mode. I think for a lot of deployments, that's probably sufficient and fine. And that the operators would either upgrade all their clients in one go or not in terms of doing this. In terms of the option 2, there is a specification in the Yang Author guidelines of how to generate that state module that's quite prescriptive and fairly easy steps. So one option here could be to say the IETF Yang modules that we run through that process and we dump those state trees and the names be well defined into GitHub, for example, and then they're just there. So I think that may be a pragmatic way forward. And then the other suggestion I had was, I think on the list is, in terms of the new Yang library and get operations, you still have a case where the existing get returns the old extra state trees, those extra state modules, but the new ones also work as before. So I think there are ways through this. Whether we need another standard or document to define that, I don't know.
Yeah, the puzzle we're facing is when we take the option 2, actually, we need to, have a complete standard solution. For every NMDA model, you should define a state module. So for some of NMDA module, they didn't define the state module, such as the module tag, or maybe some other cases. So that will delay implementation. So how do you address this?
So I think it's just you need to publish. If it's IETF routing, you publish an IETF routing-state. I think that's okay with the same version number, and you follow the rules of how to generate it, and then you've got that state tree. So even if they've not included it in the appendix, the module, how to construct that equivalent state module is defined. So it logically exists, even if it doesn't physically exist as a file somewhere. And I think 2 different vendors could independently generate that same module.
Yeah.
Tim, do you want to go?
Okay, so Kent as a contributor. So you agree that there's an NMDA transition period. I mean, that is in fact what we have right now. We are in an NMDA transition period, so I don't think there's anything to agree on. You also, earlier on your other slide, I think it was solution number 2, you mentioned the possibility that that state module is missing. But I think that's a hypothetical. Like, do you actually have an example of a state module that's missing?
Yeah, module tag actually is a typical example.
right, and that one, that particular draft was discussed on lists just recently. It's okay for that draft to not have a dash state equivalent because it contains no config false nodes, and also it has no meaningful operational impact to track the operational value of the config true nodes. So it's actually allowed to not have a dash state variant for that draft.
Yeah, but I see the Andy response, actually, he sees this wrong, but I don't know. But maybe this is not a good example, actually. We have some other examples, just, afraid for some of the NMD compliant model doesn't define state module. So this state module should be follow the NMD young guideline. And, but this is not a standard state module. So it just defined in the appendix should, we are afraid maybe different people, different developer implement in different ways. That will cause, a lot of interoperability issues.
Are you saying that there are models that are progressing right now through the IETF that don't have dash state that are NMDA compliant?
Yeah, I haven't checked this.
So if that exists, we should go back to the working group that's progressing that and tell them they should add dash state.
Okay.
Unless there's a reason not to. And if the ISG is processing, we have an AD in the room, if the ISG is processing such in other areas, the ISG should say you need to conform with the BCP. And it is true that, like in tags, one of the ways you can conform is we've looked at it and don't think it's appropriate for this particular module. So that's an okay way to conform with the BCP.
Okay.
But if it's going on, and really this is a comment to our AD to bring back to the ISG, is please make sure that the BCP is being followed.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. We definitely need this BCP.
As an addition to that, currently the BCP says that I think it's the introduction or the abstract should say that the module conforms to NMDA or not. Right, I think it just says to NMDA. Well, it should also have in it the thing like we have explicitly looked at and have concluded that it's not necessary to conform to NMDA. So it's explicitly said. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Maybe that's just something the guidelines should be modified to support.
Yeah.
Okay, but regardless, I think what Rob said earlier is that if there is a missing dash state on a published draft, we can always retroactively go back and publish the dash state for it.
Okay.
Okay, Tim, are you ready to?
Yeah, so Tim carrying up, just real quick. So there are other organizations that are muddling through this same problem as well, except their problem is actually broader than your problem because they were silly enough to say, let me utilize other SDO's work prior to creating modules on my own, right? So they said, I'm going to go look at the IETF, I'm going to go look at the IETF, there's stuff there that solves the problem, I'm going to go use it. Well, the problem is that when we moved to NMDA, right, there are organizations that said, I'm not going to produce a module that doesn't have a state module. I'm not going to produce state modules for NMDA compliant modules, right? So there's organizations that's their standard operating procedure. There are organizations that says that we'll do that, right? And so there's a problem in the industry that we're not consistent on how we're going to approach the transition to NMDA. And I would say that as the authors and the owners of Yang, it probably is incumbent upon this group, us, to provide guidance where it's necessary above and beyond the IETF. Right? Now we've done that in some of the guidance. I will say the guys in some of the groups that I'm working in have looked at that since 2018, and has made some decisions of it, right? As to, and I can't go into too much because it's a closed member organization, right? Have made decisions on it. Some of the decisions that have been made here says everything has to be a state module, but they're getting caught up in some of the permutations that even was missed in earlier drafts where it says I've got non-compliant clients, client, 4 permutations, right? Compliant server, right? Non-compliant clients, non-compliant servers, non-compliant blah, 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 right? And what are you doing? And they're getting hung up around like some of the operations that were introduced in NMDA, like GET, right? Or GET data, whichever one it was. And so my concern is that if we don't talk about this, I don't know if we've got all the pieces in place that we can give from industry the necessary guidance that they need to get through this, right? If we're just saying, hey, create state modules and look at the existing PCPs, I'm saying there's enough questions out there that still not being answered. Some of the resolutions in this one group was simply, we'll wait until it actually gets a hold and then we'll worry about it then. I mean, that was the resolution to a couple of the issues that they're looking at.
Okay, so we are out of time. Just quickly, so three things. One, and we'll have to take all this to the list, but one, I'm wondering if we should consider a flag day, something on the order of, I mean, currently the guidelines say, you know, as soon as possible, but maybe we should, as a working group, say, how many years? 1 year, 2 year, 3 years? Like, is there a deadline? Should there be a deadline? If so, could we do that? Secondly, Andy had written something to Jabber, but we don't have time to go about module text. And lastly, Lou wanted to ask if there was some interest in doing a liaison to address your issue, Tim. Again, we're out of time, so we'll take all that to the list. We'll try.
Thank you.
Just one quick one. There is like a Yang next meeting tomorrow morning, and I would like to know what is this about, a side meeting?
Yeah, forgot to mention, actually, there's a young next step meeting on Tuesday morning. I can't remember the room. You can check the wiki page for the side meeting. And we'll organize this meeting to discuss some more issue maybe related to the NMDA transition, but not at all. Not this one, actually,
So
just.
I actually want to, I want to emphasize that's actually not a working group activity. So it is a side meeting.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in it, you should go, but it is not one of our things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If you haven't signed the blue sheet, please come up and do so. This is your last opportunity.
Well, we may have signed the other one. I'm not sure which one you may have signed. Also,